All right, good evening, folks. Welcome to another apologetics training class. This evening, we've got Bob speaking to us about are science and atheism compatible? So, take it away, Bob.
Thank you. And yeah, Raman was asking me about this. The inspiration for this talk was just there's so many are science and faith compatible talks out there, and they're good ones, don't get me wrong. But it's such a ubiquitous topic, and then while listening to an audiobook of a book called Stealing from God by Frank Turek, that kind of germinated the seed for making this. So some of these ideas are probably taken from him. I should really credit him someplace. But before I do, I want to mention the points I'm not making, because I realize in a sense this could be it is a provocative title. I like provocative titles. But I want to make it clear what kind of provocations I am and am not going to engage in this. One is that I'm not going to assert that you have to be a theist in order to do science. There's a lot of atheists out there who are doing perfectly good science, so I'm not saying it's a prerequisite. I'm also not going to attempt here to make an argument about whether atheism or theism is true. Now, I have opinions on it, but that's not really my goal here either. My goal is to basically demonstrate that a theistic world, or at least argue that a theistic worldview gives you better support for the assumptions that underlie science than atheistic/materialistic worldview. And by atheistic materialistic, I mean not only belief in no God, but believe the material is all there is. Although I do kind of wander outside that a little bit in the talk, and I'll get to that. So let's start off with one question: what is science? I think we all know what atheism is, and we know what compatible means, but we do want to make sure we understand what science is in order to be able to unpack some of its assumptions. And then I'll talk about three things we need, among other things, to do science. They're not the only three. This is not going to be a comprehensive list, but these are three parts that are very critical to the whole scientific endeavor. And then the question that I'll be asking with each of these is which worldview is ultimately more consistent with these assumptions? Atheism, materialism, or theism? So, my go-to for definitions for things is dictionary.com to find the definition of science. And what they give us is a branch of knowledge or study dealing with a body of facts or truths systematically arranged and showing the operation of general laws. So the mathematical science. So science as the stuff, and then another definition is the pursuit of the stuff and then the stuff itself. Systematic knowledge of the physical or material world that's gained through observation and experimentation. Now notice the word system is in both of those, so let's throw in the bonus definition, and that is an assemblage or combination of things or parts forming a complex or unitary whole. You think of a mountain system or a railroad system. So the idea is that you have not just a body of facts that's relating to reality, but also a systematic arrangement of those facts into a coherent whole, or at least as much of a coherent whole as we're able to accomplish. And that's the definition of science we're going to work off here. Now, among other things, and I said this is not going to be a comprehensive list, but a few of the foundational things we need for science are: one, we need to be able to trust in our minds to accurately observe and interpret. In order to do science, we have to make observations about the world around us through our senses, through the use of machines, and so on. And then we need to draw relationships between those things, cause-effect relationships, so on and so forth. So we need to trust that our minds are up to the task. This might seem elementary, but I'll go into a little bit and understand why it's not so straightforward. Second is we're assuming here that the universe actually makes sense, that there are natural laws, there are relationships to be discovered, that they happen consistently, that if I drop a bar of ivory soap in a bathtub repeatedly, it's going to repeatedly float. That repeatability, its consistency is a critical part of it. Again, something we take for granted, but something we need to think about. And then trust in each other, because ultimately science is built upon the work of the generations before us. Nobody goes all the way back to first principles and derives everything they know. They build on each other's work. And again, all three of these, when for most scientists, are just part of the wallpaper. They're part of the background. They're things we just assume are there. But do we have to? So the first question is, can we trust our own minds? So let's start off with one of the foundational philosophical assumptions of science, which is called the law of causality. And Merriam-Webster defines it as every change in nature is produced by some cause. So as an illustration, we have, say you have a billiard ball. You want to pocket I think the red's the 1. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea is that you're going to use a causal chain in order to make this happen. The pool cue is going to hit the cue ball square. That in turn is going to hit the red ball, and then the red ball is going to go in the pocket, unless I'm playing it, in which case what will happen is the cue ball will hit the red ball at an oblique angle, send it banking off the side bank there, and then into the middle of the table. But you get the idea. There's these cause and effect relationships. If nobody picks up a pool cue and hits the ball will sit there in that same position until someone comes along and moves it, or there's an earthquake or whatever. There has to be a cause behind the effect of moving the ball. Now, this is philosophical. You can't prove the law of causality using science. It is an undergirding of science. Because if we don't have a law of causality, there's no way to make meaningful connections among the things we observe. If we can't, if I pick up my keys and let go of them, and they drop to the ground, without the law of causality, I don't have a way of making any kind of meaningful relationship among those things. So why does it matter? Let's unpack it a little bit more. There's 2 kinds of causation that we need to be concerned with, and I promise this is going someplace that makes sense. Event causation means one event causing another, which in turn causes another. Dominoes falling is a good example. You've seen those displays. People have millions of dominoes. They make clown faces and American flags and stuff, and it's just one domino falling after another. There's no choice involved. If you set up the dominoes correctly, then what's going to happen is absolutely predictable from the word go. The other is agent causation, and this is where you have an agent who's capable of free choice, who does something in a way that's not completely determined by preconditions. So back to the dominoes example. Somebody has to push the first domino over in order for the thing to start again. Otherwise, you'll have a beautiful display of dominoes that never does anything. So if we think about our dominoes, we have an example of event causation, which are the dominoes that fell up to the middle of the image. And then the agent causation of a hand coming in and intervening and stopping the whole process. So, event causation is a philosophical assumption. Again, it undergirds all of science. This whole law of causation, that A can cause B, which causes C, which causes D, and there's this chain of cause and effect events. There is no material explanation for event causation. And in fact, because there's some atheists who've argued that event causation doesn't actually exist, that it's an illusion, that everything we do actually is determined, that molecules in motion is one of the terms that's used for it, that basically everything that we do is ultimately determined by a cause previous to that's completely independent of the state of our mind. So in an atheistic materialistic worldview, you can still make the assertion that agent causation exists. A number of atheist philosophers do, but that it's just not explainable because we don't have anything in the natural world like it. But to do science, we have to assume that we can accurately observe our external world. And we also have to assume that we can accurately take the information that we observe and arrange it into a coherent framework, and that this framework is going to be consistent with the reality of our external world. But if there is no agent causation, if everything is just a bunch of dominoes that start falling from the Big Bang and going on, how can we know conclusively that our conclusions are actually caused by correct application of rational thought like we think they do, or that they're actually just some other event cause, that again there's something going causally all the way back to the Big Bang that made us conclude this thing about the world? Now you may say, well, this is crazy. Of course, who would think such a thing like that? Who would believe that your genes might be overriding your reason? Actually, this argument has been made by some that belief in God among humans is actually genetically caused. That at some point in time, mutation occurred that made some humans prone to believe in God, and that this gene was selected for survival. There's a number of papers, I've actually read a couple of them on this topic. The problem with this argument is that you could apply it to anything and everything that we believe, including the results of science itself. In other words, I could argue to the writer of the paper that you didn't draw those conclusions because you thought about them. You drew those conclusions because of some other evolutionary feature or some other causal chain that's completely independent of you that led you to that point. So in other words, that's ultimately becomes a self-defeating argument. So the first question, again, to summarize it, can we trust our minds as the tools, the critical tools we need to be able to observe the world around us and to be able to draw relationships with it? And the challenge is that in an atheistic materialistic worldview, there's no explanation for agent causation. There's only event causation. So the possibility exists that what we're thinking, what we think we know, may not actually align with reality in whole or in part, but could be the result of event causes we may not even be consciously aware of. Again, that's an argument that's been made about why, by some, about why people believe in God, because there are genetic event causes they have no conscious awareness of. But a theistic worldview allows for the possibility of agent causation as a property of the agent creator who imputed it to his selected creatures. So the question, which is a more plausible basis for trusting our observations and reason in doing science? And again, I'm not making lead pipe cinch arguments here, but just understanding, given that this assumption, which worldview offers more plausible support for the agent causation that is required for us to be able to trust our senses and our reason. So what about the universe? Why is it that some people ask the question of why is there something rather than nothing, which is a good question, but also why is the behavior of the universe so consistent, and why is this so much of it can be explained by things like mathematical equations? And quiz for those who are engineering or science with STEM majors in here. What is it? Yep. What is this one?
Law of universal gravitation.
Very good. This one. Yep. This one.
Ideal gas law.
Brandon is on tonight. All right, and energy. Yes, the one that the one that everybody yes, the one that everybody knows and no one understands. So in other words, where does all of this information come from? And to explain a little bit more what I mean by that, there's a difference between complexity and information. That orderly complexity, so you have something that's very complex but also has patterns in it, is another way of describing information, and the universe is chock full of it. Those are just some examples. And just to illustrate, a pile of bricks is complex, lots of details in it, but it's disorderly. There's no real pattern to it. They're just there in any kind of, thrown any which way by the dump truck or whatever. But when you take those bricks and you make a house out of it, suddenly you've got something that's complex, but also very orderly. There are lines, there are patterns, there are angles, there are shapes. So there's a vast difference, even though the stuff on the left and on the right may be exactly the same. All right, there's some wooden glass there, but humor me. But that the difference is that there is an order in this complexity. There are patterns to it. So the question is, where does this come from? Where does all of this complex information in the material universe, all of these laws, all this information come from? The only options are it either came from some other information-rich cause. So in other words, you had a designer who created the design, you had a programmer who created the programmer, or it's uncaused, that it's entirely coincidental and so it's not really information. And I mean, this is an incredibly simple example where, is it possible to just grab a bunch of letters out of your alphabet soup and drop them in there and get them spelled lunchtime? Yeah. Lunchtime's not that complex. But this is way simpler than the order that we see in the material universe. So the question is, where did this all come from? So could it be uncaused? Certainly possible. Because it's certainly possible. It is there exists a non-zero probability that this house spontaneously assembled itself from a collection of bricks with no driving information behind it. It's a non-zero probability, but it's incredibly implausible. Is it more likely that the information here came from a designer? That again, all of these shapes, the angles, all of that stuff was the product of a design rather than something that just came together, that rather than just a whole bunch of stuff that looks like information but isn't really information because there's no cause behind it. And again, if we're saying that about the house, what about the universe? Where does all that information come from? So was it event caused? Did an event happen? Something, as in the falling dominoes kind of thing. Multiverse theory is one of the possibilities of this, that there exists some kind of a substrate, something outside of the universe that basically, from which our universe came into existence. And the idea that, some theory that there are a whole bunch of, our universe is constantly popping to existence like soap bubbles, and that it's an attempt to defeat the teleological argument by saying there's a bunch of universes that popped into existence but didn't have all the right constants, and so they collapsed upon themselves, or or other horrible things happened to them, and that we happen to be in the one where everything turned out just ducky. And this external substrate, whatever you would call it, it's not material, but this, whatever it is outside the universe from which it came, could be eternal and thus not need a cause. And that's part of multiverse theory, is that you don't have to have a cause for the multiverse because the multiverse always existed and is always popping these universes out like little soap bubbles. But this leads to a philosophical challenge, because even if the something, whatever we'll call it, the multiverse, is uncaused, something still had to cause our universe to come into existence. And the event that caused our universe to come into existence must have been caused by something else. And that something else had to be caused by something else, and so on. And this train of causation would have to go back forever, which isn't possible. A way to think about this is try to imagine, I couldn't find a pick for this one, but imagine an infinite, imagine a row of dominoes that starts, by your right hand and goes off into infinity. And you flick the first one. And of course, you'll never get to the last domino. Even though there's a starting point, you'll never, ever, 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 ever get to the last domino. There's a start, but there's never a stop. Do it in reverse, where the dominoes are instead, falling from the other direction. They'll never get here, by definition, because they're an infinite distance. There's an infinite number of dominoes. So you can't have, philosophically, an infinite chain of events going all the way back forever, because you'll never get to the present day or to the present event. Because like I said, the problem is no matter how far you go back, there's always another domino. You never, ever, ever get to the first one, and you never, ever get to here. So what about an agent? We said we can have falling dominoes. We can also have an agent causation, that basically someone personal, someone capable of volitional decisions outside the universe caused it. And this someone could be eternal and hence uncreated, thus not require cause. One of the arguments that's often made by atheists is who created God, and the argument is God is not created. But if you have a God who is capable of agent causation, this removes the infinite regress problem. You're no longer dealing with a set of dominoes that started falling in time infinity past and somehow gets here, because now you don't have this infinite regress problem. My choice to use an overhand knot to tie my shoelaces instead of using a double knot, doesn't have a causal chain of events that goes all the way back forever. So this is a way out of that challenge. So a summary. The question, can we trust the universe? And we've said the universe is incredibly rich in information. I don't know the half of it. Raman could tell you things that would make my head spin as far as just under a lot of how all this stuff works. But I deal with just the atmosphere of Earth, and that's enough to keep me quite entertained. But again, for an atheistic, materialistic worldview, you don't have a solid explanation as to where this information come from, the information that is inherent in the scientific laws, that's inherent in all of the structure. Because it either had to come from nothing and we have no observable instances of any complex information ever coming from nothing. Again, no one's ever blown up a printing press and gotten a book out of it. Or from something that we can't observe by definition because it exists outside the universe. Even if we posit something like the multiverse, there's no way we're ever going to be able to observe the multiverse because it is outside the universe and we can't observe things outside the universe. All we can do is try to characterize it based on its effects. But even if it's something, we still run into this infinite regress problem, and that's a philosophical problem. That's not a mucking around with, you change the laws of physics and the problem goes away. This is one of the things that underlies science that is independent of the laws of physics. There is no laws of physics that you can play around with that get rid of this problem of infinite regress. That again, you're basically tipping, you have a set of dominoes that start falling in time infinite past. It's never going to get here. Just as if you start tipping it, do it backwards, and you start tipping it now, it'll never get to the end. A theistic worldview posits that if you have an incredibly intelligent mind, that is a plausible source of all the information content of the universe. And so the question again is, which is the more plausible basis for an orderly universe? And then finally, a third one, and this may seem, this is probably going to be different. Full disclosure, I'm the Scientific Integrity Office for my part of NOAA, so I deal with this a lot. Any new scientific knowledge we have is always going to be built on the foundation of the accumulated knowledge from all the generations that came before us. Again, nobody has the time to check every piece of work that was ever done and to go all the way back to first principles and everything. There's a tremendous amount of trust that goes into this. How do we know this foundation is solid? And sure, we have ways of checking. We have peer review and other things where people check each other's work. We have attempts to reproduce things. But again, it's kind of like, does anybody ever eat their dinner only after first making absolutely sure that nobody's put arsenic in it? Like, no. There are certain assumptions you just kind of make when you do these things. And one of the assumptions we make as scientists is that the work that has been done before us is trustworthy. We can't get around it. We have to trust each other. Now, is this, and one thing to talk about in the computer science realm is that you have vulnerabilities that are exploitable, but that there's a difference between a vulnerability that's exploitable and one that's actually being exploited. So we're just because something's a vulnerability, if no one's going after it, you may make it a lower priority than something that people are going after. So the question here, yeah, scientists could make stuff up. Would they? Sadly, I see this all the time. And I'm doing this one for the Maryland people in the room. I don't know this person. But given that part of our alma mater is, may no act of ours bring shame to one heart that loves thy name. Yeah, this hurts. This one, on the other hand, UMBC, former department chair, who got caught faking data in at least 13 different papers. And then we have one Nobel Prize winner. These all came out in Retraction Watch within the span of less than a week. Retraction Watch is pretty much good for having one of these a day. A lot of plagiarism, but there's a lot of shenanigans going on. Now, I'm not saying that to say that, they're all a bunch of, lying, conniving cheaters.
Yeah, otherwise we'd be out of a job.
Right, but I'm saying it's and this is I actually gave a talk a couple weeks ago to a bunch of grad students talking about scientific integrity, and pointed out there are pressures that they're going to face that they need to be ready for. One is that the United States is in a lot of fields producing way more doctorates than the market can support. That's very true in my field. I see people doctorates in meteorology who are doing stuff that have absolutely nothing to do with meteorology and don't require doctorates. I'm not saying they're baristas, but they're doing a whole bunch of other stuff like, this is not a good use of your doctorate. And research funds from the public sector, from i.e. the government, are either level or declining as budgets get tighter, and there's always private research funds, but those come with strings attached, implicitly or explicitly. So the result is more pressure. We've got an increasing number of scientists competing for fewer and fewer dollars. And there was an article that appeared in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society probably about 15 years ago talking about the challenge that scientists are spending so much time writing proposals that are having, they're writing more proposals than ever. They're having a lower success rate than ever, and they have less time than ever to do the actual science for which the proposals are being written. And some scientists feel they have to cheat to survive. I don't know if any of you, well, Barron's old enough to remember the steroid scandals in Major League Baseball about 25 years ago. And everybody knows about, Mark McGwire hitting 70 home runs, and Sammy Sosa hitting to 62, and then Barry Bonds doing 73, and his head being so big that I don't know how his neck could support it. And those guys, like I said, Barry Bonds. I mean, his dad Bobby was in the Hall of Fame. I think he wanted to live up to his dad's reputation. Some of these guys, they wanted to be king of the world. They wanted to make a name for themselves. But there were many multitudes of guys in baseball who doped, as in they took performance enhancing drugs because they wanted to stay on the roster. They weren't worried about being in the Hall of Fame. They just wanted to not have to be playing for the rest of their lives in the grapefruit leagues in Des Moines, Iowa. So one of the things I really emphasize with the student whenever I give this talk every year is don't think that you're only going to have this temptation if you want to be a department chair and a scientific association fellow, whatever. Everybody's going to have to deal with this now and make decisions. So then the question is, in light of that, how do we ground the need to be honesty? And the challenge is, in an atheistic, materialistic worldview, there is no grounding at all for objective morality. So in other words, objective morality that is true for everybody. An objective morality that is, true as in, that table is brown and has two legs, not true as in, mint chocolate chip ice cream is any port in a storm kind of stuff. There's a difference. That there's no universal standard, and there's no one to enforce the universal standard. Ultimately, it's only wrong if you get caught. Now, again, I'm not saying that most scientists or most atheists are like that. Most of them do have a moral code. They do have a belief that some things are right or some things are wrong. But ultimately, the problem is that those moral codes aren't grounded in objective reality. They're ultimately grounded in something subjective. They're grounded in their own preferences. And that makes them a lot more vulnerable to being bent and played around with. Now, again, there's some, it's not like this is completely without rules. You have the funding sources, you have journals who check things, you've got now a bunch of watchdogs like Retraction Watch and people who have actually developed a cottage industry basically trying to catch scientists cheating. And so there are professional standards, there are enforcements of those standards, but it's only going to get you so far. So how do we ground the need for honesty? If in a theistic worldview, we have an objective grounding and we have an objective, we have an objective grounding and we have an objective referee. Maybe a referee is not the term because he also makes the rules. But the point is that we believe if in a theistic worldview there is a creator who has set forth a set of standards as to what is right, what is wrong, that are not mind dependent. And he has the authority to enforce a standard. Now, I'm not saying that theists follow the rules all the time. Plenty of evidence for that all over the interwebs, that just because you have a theistic grounding for your morality doesn't mean you follow the terms of your morality. There's some pretty disgraceful stories out there, and I don't need to get into them. But at least you got a basis. At least if you're going to decide this is right or this is wrong, you have a basis for doing that. That's not going to shift around. So again, can we trust each other? And I think that again, in an atheistic worldview, there's no basis for objective morality. It's all subjective. Even if you say it's evolution, that's subjective. That's my genes versus your genes. You say social contract, okay, that's my society then versus your society. And the thing with social contracts, if you're going to argue morality is social contract, then all reformers are bad, right? Because they're going against their particular society's social contract. contract. And again, I'm not saying, there are a lot of atheist scientists out there who are perfectly honest and whose work I trust. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to make this sound like this is, everybody's creepy and weird. But again, that ultimately their standards and motivations are going to be subjective in nature at the end of the day. Whereas for a theist, your morality is, or should be, ultimately grounded in and ultimately enforced by your Creator. So again, what's a more plausible basis for trusting each other's work? I'm not trying to make it an all or nothing or saying that there's no there's no such that you can't be a good scientist if you're an atheist. But what I'm saying is that when we look at the key factors involved, which worldview better supports them? And again, the ability to trust in our minds, the ability to accurately observe, the ability to interpret what we're seeing, the knowledge that the conclusions we arrive at are not simply the result of some causal chain going back to the Big Bang that has nothing to do with what's in front of us, but that we're actually making free will decisions. Now, does it mean they're going to be perfect? Of course not. Science would never change if it did. That doesn't mean we don't change our minds and find new information, but we've got to be able to trust that we're thinking straight and that we're actually capable of making observations and making, and building systems out of those observations that are congruent with reality outside of us. Again, we have to have trust in the universe, that there's real information out there to discover, that the universe really does. I mean, one of the things you get a number, and I wanted to get the quotes and I didn't get to them in time, get to do it in time. But that there are a couple of different sides. I think Johannes Kepler talked about, thinking God's thoughts for him. That there were a number of scientists who were believers, and that their belief in God's orderliness was what drove them to assume that the universe He created is the same way. That there is information, that there is order, that there is structure to be found. But if you're stuck with the assumption that either this is causeless entirely, or of a cause that you can never discover and that runs into some serious philosophical challenges, are you sure? And then trusting in each other. That again, we need to be able to rely on each other's work. And again, my question is, which one provides better support for science? Atheism, materialism, where we don't know if our minds work like we think they do. We don't know where all this information in the universe came from and if it's real. And we don't have any ultimate reason to trust each other or to be honest. Or theism, which explains all three. And again, you could make the argument as a scientist, it's the same thing, a reason why I don't test my food for poison every time I eat it. You have to go through life. There's always a finite possibility that a 9-foot Steinway is going to fall out of an airplane and hit me on the way out home from here. But I'm going to live my life based on, I've got to make decisions. But I think it still asks questions of which of these two worldviews offers a more plausible framework for doing science. And I'll open the floor for questions. And open the mic. Any questions?
Going back to what you were saying before about atheists having to assert agency?
Agency. Well, basically, you have no support for agency.
Yeah. So have you ever seen any attempts to try and ground agency in anything, or is it just been always treated as a brute fact?
I've only seen it treated as a brute fact. I have not done, of course this is one of those things that doesn't mean this necessarily isn't something out there, but brute fact is the best I've ever been able to find. Well, either brute fact or again, there's some who have concluded that it actually doesn't exist. That we think we're agents, but we're not. Of course, that runs into some other issues. There's Greg Kokel, it's quite funny, because there's one, I forget the name, it's not Michael Shermer, it's one of the other well-known atheists who argues that consciousness is an illusion. And Greg's answer is, then what's having the illusion? Like, you can't have an illusion without consciousness, because the idea of an illusion is having a perception of something that is not in line with reality. You can't have that without consciousness, because otherwise it's going to be completely causal.
Maybe that's more just about, but that's just language games. So that's just rather that it's not being free. It would have been a better way to put it.
No, because it's by Sully would argue. What can you have? Can you have an illusion without? Can you incorrectly perceive something without consciousness?
That depends on what the definition of consciousness that's being posited is. So I think in that case, for that discussion to have any meaningful outcome, is you have to have a solid definition of consciousness that everybody can agree on.
That's fair. Sorry, I know this was one of those. I probably could have split this in about 15 talks and still not drilled deep enough. But
that's good. What is agency? Like we have agency, like we have the ability to choose. Is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Okay.
So in other words, agent. So if there were a row of dominoes on the table, when I flick the first one, that's agent, because I can do it whenever I want. I could do it now. I could do it 5 minutes from now. I could do it when I could do it. I could never do it. But the second domino falling is event, because the second domino is going to fall whenever the first one hits it. It doesn't have any kind of choice in that matter, and that is event causation.
Oh. When you were talking to those atheists like a few weeks back, what were some of the things they brought up?
Yes, they did say something. I'm trying to remember. Give me 1 second.
It's okay. And I can always happy to take questions over email or over coffee or over ice cream.
Oh,
I have no reservations at all about going to the creamery.
you know how the Bible is like, you need Jesus to, you know what I mean,
Mhm.
to beat temptations and to, all that type of stuff. People who don't believe in Jesus, they still beat temptations. So is that, that's what they were telling me about too, about that. What is your talk? What are you saying on that?
So are they? I mean, I don't. So are they? I guess the argument they're trying to make is that the capability of being able to say no to a temptation means that you don't need Jesus.
Yeah, like for example, like let's use like lust. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or like battling lust. Maybe people are in a very cycle of that.
Mm-hmm.
Some people break it and they're not even Christians. And then some people who are Christians, when they break it, they'll be like, give glory to God.
Mm-hmm.
And then some people who are not, are like, I broke it without love that. So
I think. Try not to make a category mistake with this one. Certainly, we are capable of saying no to something if we have something else that's greater to say yes to. I mean, I think that's, and I think certainly even without the work of the Holy Spirit, I think Christians are, they're capable of doing things that are not sinful. But I think there's a difference, but I think ultimately, if you don't, without Christ, your ultimate motivation, when it boils down to it, is yourself. You may have to go through a whole bunch of degrees to get down to that. But that ultimately your motivation, at the end of it, is going to be self-serving, even if it's something that is altruistic, but it's altruistic from a self-serving motive. Whereas if you're a follower of Christ, God gives you the capability to make decisions, to do things that are not just self-serving, but are out of a desire to honor Him. It's a process. It's not like flicking a switch. I mean, there are some things that I stopped when I became a Christian 35 years ago, I stopped struggling with immediately, and there are some things I'm still struggling with 35 years later. So I wouldn't try, I don't think that's a very helpful line of thought, though, to try to make a is it true or is it not true argument. Because I don't think that's necessarily good ground for doing it, because then it's kind of coming down to, because what you're basically saying that is the truth of God's existence predicated on whether or not someone who's not a Christian is capable of making a decision that society would deem as morally virtuous. And I don't think you've got anything there. I don't think that's a place. I don't think that you prove anything by either way. I think bigger ones are, I mean, bigger ones is certainly, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or at least his, if the Bible gives it, seems to give a very reliable historical record. Even many secular scholars, like the majority, agree that, Jesus lived, he was crucified on a cross, the tomb was empty, and how we got from, why the tomb was empty, of course, there's a dramatic amount of disagreement on, and that many of his followers believe that they saw him. That would be one. Another one, just the argument again. I kind of alluded to this a little bit. Of what's called the cosmological argument, that the universe had a beginning. Where did it come from? What is the cause of what is the cause of which the universe is the effect? Is it uncaused, or is it caused by something? If so, what is the cause? The teleological or design argument. And there's another talk I've given, I can't remember if we have a recording of it or not, the different arguments for God's existence, but another is the teleological argument, which is a bit of a sideways in some of the stuff I talked about, the information content of the universe is so incredibly finely tuned, and the question is, where did that come from? Did this just come from chance? Because again, when we see something as simple as, if you're walking in the woods and you see something as simple as an arrowhead left by the native peoples from centuries ago, nobody questions that it was designed, even though the information content in it is relatively small. And yet you have, you have the universe, which is so incredibly finely tuned. You have so much complexity in human DNA, ridiculous amounts of information content. And the argument, how do you explain all of that coming into existence? And then the moral argument is there, if someone believes in an absolute right and wrong, and you only need one moral law to do it. I mean, if everybody agrees that torturing babies for fun is morally wrong, then there is one absolute moral law, and that's all you need to say there's an absolute moral law. And again, where does that come from? It's got to come from somebody has the authority to. And where's the obligation come from? Because with laws come obligations. I mean, it's not just that the law says don't drive more than 25 on Baltimore Avenue, but that if you get your picture taken driving more than 25 on Baltimore Avenue, you will be separated from the contents of your wallet. Because the City of College Park and the State Highway Administration have the authority to do that. If I put a speed limit 25 sign on my front lawn that looked exactly like the one on Baltimore Avenue, nobody needs to pay attention to it. But then where does that come from? Yes, Cass?
Question. How would they even know? How do they even know where you put up, or where the State of College Park put it up?
How would they know that I put it up?
Yeah.
They actually wouldn't if I put it up correctly, but the point is there's no authority behind it, though. There's not going to be anybody who's going to write somebody a ticket for going more than 25 on Tecumseh Street because there's a sign in my front lawn that the City of College Park didn't put up. Austin?
I was talking to my atheist friend a few weeks ago, and he was talking about the order and design of the universe, and he was saying I don't know how he put it, but he was like, the fact that we're here is we wouldn't be able to say it's.
We wouldn't be able to speculate on the fact that we're here unless the chain of events that led to us being there happened.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I know the argument. I know the argument.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you could elaborate on that one.
Okay, so you basically say, this thing that's very, very, like the fact that we're here is this very, very, very unusual thing, but the argument they use against it is the only reason that we can argue about this is because it did happen, but it was still a finite probability.
Yeah.
That's essentially the argument,
Mm-hmm.
or how it runs. In some senses, it doesn't actually address the original question, which is the actual probability and the fact that the probability is so low.
Yeah.
It just says that it's a truism.
And again, we don't make decisions based on that. If you go to Las Vegas and you hit blackjack too many times, they're not going to listen to a story of, the fact I won this much means I beat the odds. They're going to escort you out and they may have you thrown in jail. It's obvious when the system is gamed. If I flip a coin and it comes out heads 50 times in a row, you're not going to think, wow, what a coincidence. You're going to think that thing's loaded.
Yeah.
So I just the challenge I have with that argument is that practically we never do things like that. I mean, it's like somebody, it's like somebody almost getting hit by a car on Baltimore Avenue and then just saying, well, I'm still here, so there's nothing ever to worry about. It's like, that's not, that the problem is it's from a practical perspective, and there's probably a more philosophically firm way of giving the of defending the argument than that. But sometimes this comes down to we don't live that way. We don't. There's a burden of proof there that we don't apply to any other part of our lives.
So when you said the types of causation, are those the only two types of causation? Because how do you talk about things in terms of logical causal order, which don't have a temporal component? So, like, say, an equation and deriving an equation, and you're following through the steps logically, but there's no component in time to that.
True.
So, is that a third area of causation, or does that fall under the event causation category? That
one would be a category that I'm not sure how you apply it to the successive occurrence of events. So that's the thing. I'm just not sure it's a category. I'm not sure it would fit in the same category in terms of what we're discussing here. Since we're talking here about we're talking here about related events or related observations.
So yeah, going back to the infinite chain of events. The infinite chain of events. The argument against infinite regression that you used seems to implicitly assume time. If you're outside of time, you essentially only have logically prior rather than temporally prior. Can you use the same argument for against infinite regression? Given that, for instance, you can, like with an infinite sum, you can essentially say a property that emerges from that infinite sum and say it approaches a limit. So in the same sense, if something's not grounded in time, does that then mean that you can't have something that emerges in a non-temporal setting? And therefore, does that mean that infinite regression in a logical, like an infinite chain of logical, right, is that still meaningless?
That's a good question. No, I need to do
Otherwise, how do you explain limits? Brandon? Yeah, I'm looking at you.
How do you explain
limits?
Some hand waving.
Because essentially you have a truth emerging from an infinite regression.
How do you explain limits?
Well, is the truth emerging or is it an asymptote?
The point is, though, is that you can say something meaningful about an infinite series and information comes of it. Yeah. You can say what happens as a result of the infinite series.
I see your point.
But is that like result? Isn't that kind of like based off a leap of faith at the end?
Well, I think part of it though is it infinite series just as a concept, or is because there are no real life infinite series. So I mean, part of the challenge with infinity is that infinity conceptually explains some things, but when you start trying to take it out of the abstract and bring it into the concrete world, things get very, very complicated. And I don't know.
I suppose the closest thing might be something like Zeno's paradox.
Which is?
So Zeno's paradox is that, all right, how is it that I can get anywhere? Because every distance that I travel can be broken up into an infinite number of sub-distances, and that means I have to travel one of those I have to travel an infinite number of
sub-distances in order to travel at all.
So how am I able to take a step? But I am.
Yeah.
I mean, well, he said that, and then I can't remember if it was Pythagoras, he just got up and walked around. And said
and appropriate time to share it. So an infinite number of mathematicians walk into a bar. First one asks for a beer. Second one asks for half a beer. Third one asks for a quarter of a beer. Fourth one asks for an eighth of a beer. Bartender holds up his hand, pours 2 beers, and says, "You guys really need to know your limits." Oh, that got recorded. Anyway. Any other questions I can answer?
Actually, no, seriously, Brandon, do you have any comments on, on limits emerging and like the idea of infinite regressions in the logical sense?
I do like Bob's explanation that infinities don't like sort of actually exist. I think that like you can't have like an infinite number of logical steps. In a sense.
Because like if infinity did exist, then Enoch's paradox thing would like work in real life, but it doesn't. Because we could walk places.
Or it could just be that we don't understand.
We don't understand.
We don't understand infinity, which is also perfectly plausible. But I mean, in terms of infinity in real life.
I remember in high school trying to do the associative property on 1 over 0 equals infinity, and then everything 0 times infinity equals 1, and watching my math teacher's face turn white.
Well, I
you
suppose
can't do that. It's like what?
I suppose from a physics point of view, actually, there are essentially sort of hard limits on distances, and the closest thing to that would be something called the Planck distance. So to some degree, it means that reality at the basis level has some form of
There's
discrete.
a quantization somewhere.
Yeah, there's a quantization. You have and it's discrete rather than continuous.
When you break it down, the universe.
So the way to think of it is that instead of it being like a single string, it's like a bunch of Lego bricks. Eventually, you hit a hard limit. You can't get any smaller than the
Right, because you get, which we used to think was
okay.
which we used to think was
so you don't have infinities because everything you can only have a certain number of Lego bricks. You can't have an infinite number of Lego bricks.
Right. Or even just that again, you have. I mean, the atom used to be the minimum limit, but then of course we found there were parts that are decent amount from that. Yeah, we're going down, but there still is a lower. There still is a lower limit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because eventually you go down. There's a. Oh, I didn't know that actually. So like, is that like below like quantum particles?
Well, that's at the quantum level.
Okay.
But then the thing is as well is that it depends on that because then the other positive theory for reality at the very basis level is string theory. So what you're essentially saying is that what you think of as a particle is actually just a vibration.
Goodbye.
It makes my head hurt too. Don't worry about it.
So essentially, everything is made up of these 10-dimensional strings, and it's just different. Anything in reality is just a different combination of vibrations.
Does that, from your experience, does that like theory?
So the string theory is very, very complicated. I don't particularly understand because I'm not a theoretical physicist. But the thing is, at the moment, is that it's very much a theory and not like a normal scientific hypothesis, because the problem is that it doesn't really produce testable hypotheses, or very few. And so the thing is that like you can make up as much, like you can do as much as you want with string theory, but the thing is, if you want to say that it's true, you have to make sure that there's some form of test that you can perform to show that it's true and that nothing else can explain the results of that test.
But you can't really do that.
So yeah, I mean that's why like the multiverse theory is also very much a theory, because you can't meaningfully talk or you can't meaningfully test anything outside the universe because you can't leave the universe.
Right. All you can do is try to make you can try to. I mean, it's similar to the arguments for God. I mean, you're not going to directly observe him, but you can observe his effects.
Yeah.
And then you try to then work backwards from that. Say, if these are the effects, what are the potential causes that would be consistent with these effects, even though we can't actually observe the cause itself.
So for the multiverse theory to ever be proved, there would have to be some form of effect from the fact that there's a multiverse on this universe that can only be attributed to the fact that the multiverse exists.
Exactly.
And couldn't be explained in any other way.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. What if you? This is so unrelated. But do you
Sorry,
guys,
we left unrelated behind a long time ago.
do you know where like a black hole goes?
No,
Okay.
nobody does. Because the point is that
It goes to the IRS building.
yeah, death and taxes. No, so we can't meaningfully talk about what happens at a singular is what's known as a singularity, because at that point, physics, our mathematical description of reality, breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't say anything, and therefore we don't know. We can't make any predictions.
Okay. Yeah. All right. That's fine. Okay. Back to God. It's unrelated. But the it comes to like infinity, the only thing that I know is infinite is God, right? And that claim that God's infinite explains why creation happened, or like why the universe can be created. Yeah.
Well, it provides a cause for, if God is infinite and God is an agent, that means that, number one, he was able to cause the universe to come into existence without getting to the infinite regress problem, but he's also still uncreated.
Anybody here have any questions?
If Adam and Eve were the only two people on the planet, how did they repopulate the whole place?
That question gets asked a lot. There are some who argue that the restrictions on incest were a lot less loose in the early Genesis area because our genes didn't have all the damage that they had now. And so a lot of the reason for not interbreeding with close relatives is that recessive genes start piling up and you start getting some very undesirable effects. So some have argued that that's what's happening. Others have made the argument that Adam and Eve were the first, may have been how to put it, that there were other hominids who were around at the time of Adam and Eve, but that Adam and Eve were the first ones to be the image bearers in terms of having a certain degree of consciousness that other creatures didn't have, and that they may have interbred with those and passed on those traits. We don't know. I mean, it's a good question, and I said it all depends. I think you can have a high view of Scripture and go with either one, as long as Adam and Eve are unique, as long as you have a unique Adam and Eve from whom the rest of humanity came. But whether you start off with just those two and no one else, and then they produce everybody else from there, or whether they were part of a larger population that was similar but did not have the Imago Dei, and then the Imago Dei, the image of God, came at that point.
Because it only, and it just feels like Cain and Abel were like two guys.
They had more
kids.
They
had more children.
Yeah.
They had more children. Part of it too is understand. I mean, number one, they say afterward they had more children, but the other is that simply because only certain children are recorded in, say, the Genesis genealogies doesn't necessarily mean that it was all of that. That's all the kids they had. Because ultimately you got to focus, because otherwise, if you try to focus on the life of every single person, it gets complicated real fast. So that's part of it, is also when looking at the genealogies, is don't just assume that the only people listed there are the only kids they ever had. They just want to trace a certain line of the genealogy for a specific purpose, and therefore they're only going to discuss those progeny along those lines.
A big argument I had with atheists is that he was talking about the Noah Ark.
Mm-hmm.
You know how Jesus said, if you accept me, you come to everyone knows that. But then people said Jesus wasn't born through that era yet. So I've been to the people that was killed in the flood, like babies, all those people who never knew Jesus. Like, what happens to those people? Like, was Noah the only righteous person that was saved, and then forgot about the rest? That was the question.
The way to think about it that's helpful, that I think is more helpful in questions, it's a good question, is that what condemns us isn't not believing in Jesus. What condemns us is everything else we've done. Believing in Jesus takes away the condemnation for what we've done, because Jesus, as a substitute, pays for sins we've committed. So humanity, the whole Romans 3:23, for all sin and fall short of the glory of God. The guilt, that for those who don't know Jesus, they are condemned not because of what they've done with Jesus, but because of all the other ways in which they have disobeyed God and violated His law. So, and sometimes people get uncomfortable with that. It's like, well, doesn't God owe everybody a pardon? It's like, He doesn't. I mean, we've all earned our condemnation. If we had earned a pardon, it wouldn't be a pardon. And when, an example is at the end of a presidential term or gubernatorial term, whatever, the executive will always give a list of people who he or she is going to pardon when they leave office, as governor, president, whatever. And no one ever raised the objective of, Governor, when Governor Moore steps, when he terms out, he's going to issue some pardons, and no one's going to say, Governor Moore should have, what about the other, X number of thousands of people who are in prison in Maryland? Why didn't Governor Moore care about any of them? No, it's part of his right and his prerogative is to issue pardons. He has the authority to do that. And the fact that he issues pardons to some does not morally obligate him to pardon every single person who's in who's in the Maryland justice system. And that likewise with God, we have all disobeyed him. We have all earned condemnation for rejecting his lordship in our lives. For those of us who put our trust in Christ, Christ has paid on our behalf for our sins, and we are forgiven. So in other words, the people who died, the people who, everybody, including Noah should have perished along with everybody else. Noah was saved. Noah and his family were saved by God's grace. They weren't saved by their own merit. Does that make sense? Because so many times we think of this whole thing of, there's these people who don't deserve hell, but they get it because they didn't believe in Jesus. And it's like, no, everybody deserves hell. It's just that through Jesus, faith in Jesus' substitutionary atonement on the cross takes away that guilt. Jesus, every sin that has ever been committed in all of human history, one of two things will happen to it. Either the person who committed it will pay for it, or Jesus will pay for it. In the end, there will be perfect justice, and that all sins will be paid for. The only question is who pays for it.
So, all the people that died went to hell?
Pardon me?
All the people that died went to hell?
As far as we know. Don't know for sure. Because it's really, Scripture hasn't told us other way.
Yeah.
But again, everybody who ever, but again, we deserve it. Everybody has rejected God to one form or other or broken his laws.
There are potentially arguments as well, though, based on, I can't remember where the verse is, where it talks about, in Peter, where it potentially talks about, which has been interpreted as Jesus going into hell and preaching in hell.
Correct, in Rome, which is such, and it's 1 Peter chapter 3. It's 1 Peter 3. I think it is so unique. And so, this is one of those things where I think you've got about 20 pieces out of a 1,000-piece puzzle, and there's a tremendous room for people to have honest disagreements about what is meant by that.
Yeah,
but that is one take. It's one I don't personally agree with, but it is people have interpreted it that way.
Yeah, I was going to say, but going back to the point is that
None
of us knows
yeah.
who is going to hell and who isn't, who is saved. Only God knows that.
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody can look like a Christian outside, look and die looking like a perfect Christian, but that doesn't mean that they were saved. Only God knows that. But what we do know is that we can trust God. So when you get a lot of these questions, because there are a lot of questions which don't really have any easy answers or don't necessarily have an answer at all. And so at that point, what you try to do, either for yourself or for other folk, is focus on the qualities of God and whether God is trustworthy. And so if you think God is good and if you think God is trustworthy, then you know that whatever the answer is, even if you don't know what it is, you know that it's the best possible answer and the right possible answer. Now, obviously, that's not going to satisfy everybody, but it's better than no answer.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That'd be kind of cool if you did.
Because there are going to be a lot of times when there is no easy answer to the question.
Because there's two things, right? Like you said, one, either Jesus died for our sins, and one, or we pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, people who don't know or didn't get preached the gospel, who don't know anything about it. So what happens to those type of people?
But there's still, Paul writes in Romans chapter 1 about those in the second half of Romans chapter 1, that even those without the law, they knew it, that we've all have enough revealed to us to basically condemn ourselves. That we, even with whatever degree of revelation we've had, that even there we've rebelled against it.
What we can trust is that God will have made a way for anybody who he deems worthy. Well, maybe worthy is not the word.
I wouldn't say deemed worthy. He makes you worthy. He doesn't deem you worthy.
Yeah, anyone he chooses, he will make a way for them. Who choose him, he will make a way for them.
I think part of the challenge too is that we have part of what makes us struggle, not only for non-Christians but for Christians, is just a lack of understanding of just how serious sin is. If we really believe that God created us out of nothing, that God sustains us at every moment, we are obligated to him in a way that no one will ever be obligated to us. We belong to him in a way that no one will ever belong to us. Even Kaz, I helped bring Kaz into the world, And Kaz is my son, and I'm very thankful for that. But there's an aspect of Kaz, there's an aspect in which Kaz is mine, but the aspect in which I am God's is a completely different order entirely. And that we don't realize how serious it is when we tell what has been called the cosmic lie. Because the ultimate sin is any sin, no matter how big or how small, is to tell a cosmic lie that God is not who he says he is. That ultimately I am the final authority and I can do whatever I want. And we don't realize the gravity of that. In part because we don't have. We have relationships with other people, but there's nothing. There's nothing. There are no relationships or authority figures or anything in the material world or anything that are anything like it. They're a shadow of it.
Yeah, like all the interactions we have on Earth, they're which is like a mere reflection of kind of like the creation of God and us. Like a parent and a son, but it's 10 times more.
Yeah, because if I get pulled aside, if I get pulled over again for doing 30.1 miles an hour on Baltimore Avenue, it's not personal. Like the police officer's going to write me a ticket, but it's not like he's going to be insulting. This is my street. How dare you drive down this 30 miles an hour? It's not going to be personal. It's completely transactional. So you get the authority part in that relationship, but imagine having the authority, but it's also personal. And even that doesn't begin to describe it. But that's the thing, because we are under God's authority as his created beings. So we are totally and fully obligated to him, but yet he also desires a relationship with us, and desired it so much that he sacrificed his only son, Christ, on the cross to make that relationship possible. But on the flip side of it also is, sin is way more serious than we think is. And to be honest, I think the reason so many Christians are so lukewarm is because we have no idea. We really have no idea what we've been saved from. Because if we don't think sin is such a big deal, if we think sin is like getting, a bad grade in a test and and the cross is a do-over, okay, that's nice, but, I'm not going to... there's a difference in the gratitude between, somebody who lends you a couple bucks so you can buy an ice cream versus someone who pulls your non-breathing, lifeless carcass out of the swimming pool and gives you mouth-to-mouth and saves your life. There's a completely different level of gratitude. And what God has done for us is a completely different order of magnitude beyond, the lifeguard without whom you'd be dead.
I have one more important one.
Sure.
Is that someone said if God is really this powerful, you know what I mean? I heard Muslims, even argue this one towards me.
Mm-hmm.
Why did he have to send his son to do that? If he's very powerful, he could have just did it himself. He could you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. He did, because Jesus is God, so he did send himself. So that's the easiest way to answer that.
Well, I think also the thing is also that people mistake when people say God is all powerful and omnipotent. It means that God can do anything. It doesn't mean that there are absolutely no limits or no meaning or no nothing. It means God can do whatever power can accomplish. God cannot make a married bachelor. God cannot make a square circle. Those things are just logical. They don't exist and they can never exist. And somehow in the way that God's character, in the way that God's character is, it was necessary for justice to be served for all offenses against him. And the only two options at that point were either, again, the offender pays for it, or God himself would pay for it. The scales had to be, because of God's nature, the scales had to be balanced. And those were the only two ways available of balancing it.
Just building on that and building on what I said before, which was a little more flippant, but if you're addressing folks in an Islamic context, their interpretation of Jesus is as a man, not God. So the first thing you have to establish when you're saying, when you're talking about this, is that Jesus is God. And the answer that I'm saying that he did send himself. Obviously, I was being a little flippant, but the point is still true. That, and because God is the only one who can deal with the problem, like Bob was saying, the only one who could die for all of humanity's sins, is someone who is perfect, and that can be no normal human being. Only God can fulfill that role, and God takes on humanity and has that perfect divine and human combined nature, and takes the sin upon himself. And so the fact is that why didn't he do anything about himself? He did do it, because he was the only one who could, because he is the only one who would be powerful enough. No one else could do that.
And then they reply back, right, and say, why did he not do it as soon as Adam committed that sin? Why could he just send himself right there and then? Or is there a certain kind of plan that
I was gonna, yeah. I mean, you can see that there's a plan from the very beginning, and if you look at the Bible is a plan. The easiest way to see this from the fact is like when you read the first chapter of John, and it talks about the fact that Jesus was there at the beginning. So this was always the plan. It wasn't a case of like God was like, oh whoops, I screwed up, I better fix this. Like he knew what he was doing right from the beginning. People sinned because he gave them free will, and like he removed himself from dictating their choices and allowed them to choose. And again, you can't make logical. You can't. If God intervenes in every choice, it's no longer a choice. Like if God stops everybody from making a sinful decision, then it's no longer a choice. If you don't have the choice to choose sin, to choose not God, then you have no choice at all. Does that make sense?
I know.
You just be like a robot.
Exactly.
Right.
So the thing is that the thing is to see that like God knew what he was doing. This was always the plan, and that is clearly laid out in the Bible.
Now, the question I ask now is like, was God's plan like, how do I say this? Was it like too bloody and too messy? You know what I mean?
The question is that, I mean, all right, so the other thing is that how could we possibly know that, right? You know, like, we are not omnipotent. We are not all-knowing. Okay, we can have a stab at it, and we can think, but the thing is that we don't know, we can't see, we don't have the big picture. So it's like when you judge something without knowing all the facts, right? And you can make a wrong decision because of that. This is like that to the nth degree. You do not have all of the facts. You do not know everything about the universe. So therefore, how can you be expected to have the right answer? Now, some people on an emotional level that won't necessarily satisfy people. On a logical level, if people think it through, then yeah. But you've got to get through God's goodness and God's rightness, and then look out and show that, you know, that God had planned this from the beginning, and that it wasn't a knee-jerk response.
Yeah.
He knew what he was doing.
So that's
But the thing is that because of free will, like then you can challenge them as like, what other way is there, and see. So that's another way of doing it, trying to get them to think through. So rather than necessarily challenging, ask them questions like, okay, so what would be a better way, and then address, you know, as they come up with answers, talk through and say, well, okay, maybe that wouldn't work because of, you know, X, depending on what they say. So, because the thing is that they'll probably say something that is likely you'll have another question that will lead to you having other questions about it.
Yeah.
I think also, thinking about this philosophically, in order to judge God, if we're going to make any kind of a judgment about God, that implies when we make a judgment about anybody, we're holding them up to an external standard. So say again, you know, if I'm driving 30 miles an hour on Route 1, which I probably do, you know, but the point is, my behavior is being held up to an external standard, and that external standard is those little black and white signs that are along the side of the road saying speed limit such and such, and that external standard is enforced by the City of College Park / the State Highway Administration. So I have both a standard, and I have someone who is in authority over me enforcing that standard. So if we're going to make a judgment about what God is doing, we need a standard that is greater than him, and we need someone greater than him to enforce his standard. Which means that, whoever that is, must be God. So then we get this infinite regress.
Yeah.
So in other words, in other words, God is the standard. He is the standard. It's not even that he came up with the standard. Like the standard is a reflection of who he is. The standard flows from his own character.
Yeah.
So in a sense, to judge it, it's like going to the National Institute of Standards and Technology and looking at their kilogram they have on display and basically trying to get into an argument with the staff. Like, no, that's not really a kilogram. That's too small. It's like, no, this is the standard of the kilogram. You cannot argue with me that this is not like this is the standard. You can't argue that the standard is wrong. Like this is the standard that you're using to make your argument.
That's like it's like saying you want to change the definition of 1 + 1 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. That makes,
Yeah, because again, like I said, if you're going to judge God, it's like that means there must be someone greater than God in order to judge him. That certainly can't be us. It's like, wait, God created us, and we're going to judge him? Like, how does that
That
work?
certainly is the original sin, is judging yourself to be greater
Yeah,
than God.
thinking, yeah, that is the reason. Thinking that you have better agency, like better, you know,
Reasons,
like
whatever.
yeah, for whatever you want. Because like in your eyes, something looks good. And then,
Right. But I mean, Romans 9, Paul asks, who are we to talk back to God? And again, it doesn't, it's irrational. Why would the thing created have anything to say about be in a position to judge the one who created it?
I think at the end of the day, at least for most humans, it's definitely like an ego thing. 'Cause it's like,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we don't like to think that we, in the grand scheme of things, we don't really like.
Right.
Yeah, like someone's better than us when it comes to morality.
It always comes down to us in the end. But one other thing I wanted to build on with asking the question, because a lot of times the question is, well, why did God do this or why did God do that? And ultimately, the question, like one of the things you ask, what do you do with the answers to the question? Like, what does the answer prove? Like, I don't know why dogs sniff other dogs and other people in places that are impolite. They do it. Like, but knowing that doesn't have any bearing on whether or not dogs exist. Like, dogs exist even though they do things that I think are weird and impolite. It has no bearing on it. Yeah. So sometimes the question too, when people ask, why did God do this or why did God do that? It's like, what does the answer get you? It doesn't prove anything. Yeah. Just because something is weird doesn't have any bearing at all on its existence or its qualities or anything like that. It just
sometimes you just have to like accept the fact. Like, I was thinking about it. I was kind of confused, like why God loves us so much. Like at the end of the day, we don't really know.
No.
You know? But I'm glad He does. But like,
yeah, exactly.
But like,
I'm not
day,
gift horses and mouths and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's some.
I mean, just following on from that as well, the thing is that a lot of the time these questions come from, not necessarily from that, it's about an attitude behind that, or some form of hurt.
Yeah.
So sometimes you can try and address the question, but the thing is that you want to try and get to what it is that's bugging the person, really, like what's right at the core of the issue, because a lot of the questions, they're not the real question, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
They're not, that's not the reason why they don't believe God or why they don't like God. There's something normally underneath that. And then very often it will be, maybe in the majority of cases, it will be emotionally driven rather than rationally driven.
That's true. Like my two friends, like I had a Gnostic friend, atheist friend. Like my atheist friend, he's like a smart guy. He was talking all about like the science stuff. When we boiled down to it, conversation went on. It was like the morality of the Bible, because he's like liberal, so like homophobia and all that. And then my agnostic friend, when he talked about it, he was like, I sure there's a higher power, but like I personally, I've gone through tough times in my life, and I haven't felt like the love that everybody else proclaims. So yeah, like that's what I realized through like these gospel conversations. It's really like emotional.
Some personal
personal
experience.
Yeah.
Feels like nobody's there for you or something like that.
I mean, the moral one's interesting because, again, the question of, okay, how do you ground the morality that you use to judge the God of the Bible? But a lot of times, because again, it's there has to be, what is the standard that you're using and what's the basis of that standard? And again, if I'm the standard, if it's that God doesn't do things I don't like, again, that's not rational that I'm going to judge the one who created me.
Ooh. Yeah.
And if you've got no grounding of your morality, if it's just your preference, then you might as well say, it's as meaningful saying eggplant is yucky. I mean, so like your disliking eggplant doesn't obligate me to eat it or not eat it. I love organ meats. Doesn't mean any of you are obligated to have beef heart soup. I wish my wife would make it again. But, so good. Oh. But anyway.
What was I gonna say?
I have no idea. I probably just took you way off track. But
I was talking to my friend like a while back, and I think we already addressed this about like it was like the why statement, and it's like if God exists or something, why would He let so and so happen to me? You know, like bad thing X happen to me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's like a big one.
I was about to say that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, some Christians on what's in the Bible it says. I mean, so just elaborate on what he said, right? Some Christians in the Bible it says the same power God has, the same power within us. And the next thing you hear on the news, a Christian died. You know, and most of them always pray, I want to live more and more life, and bad things happen to them, and they prayed. So
yeah, or like a Christian, you can be a Christian and you get like cancer at like 40 or something.
there you go.
And it's like,
But I mean, there's no place in Scripture that promises. I mean,
Yeah.
look at the life of Paul.
oh no, yeah.
Oh,
I mean, remember again, the last words, which I don't, I mean, Paul must have found out when Luke wrote them in the book of Acts, but that last comment of Ananias, that when God appeared to Ananias in Damascus and told him Paul was going to meet him, and the very last thing that's recorded that Paul said, that God said to Ananias is, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. And it's never recorded that Ananias actually told Paul at that point. I've often wondered if, like, Paul was, that Ananias, like, gives Paul the little spiel, restores his sight. It's like, so did God say anything else to you? I don't think so. I can't tell you this, but
I think Paul pretty much worked it out when he gives like the long list of things that's happened. To
oh
him.
yeah, he one way or another he figured it out. But the point is, I mean, Paul was on, and even you see this a lot with Christians that we get into this whole thing of prosperity, but even this whole thing of trying to find this exact dot of God's will. And with so many of us, it's I want to be in the center of God's will because there I'm going to be safe. Like, where in Scripture does it say that if you're in the center of God's will, that everything's going to be hunky-dory? Like, that's not how this works. You could be in the center of God's will and have things go all over the place. That's not, God hasn't promised us that everything's going to be, sunshine and puppies and granola if we're in the center of His will. It's such a this bizarre outgrowth of 20th century American evangelicalism that's just so unbiblical.
But also, it's in terms of looking at what is your ultimate goal or your ultimate good.
Bingo.
So the thing that you forget about, okay, let's say somebody dies early from, say something like cancer and they're a Christian. Well, on the one hand, that is tragic, but on the other hand, that means they got to God quicker.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at it, if you take it from the big picture point of view, again, and you look at it, you zoom out from this life and you zoom out one level above, and you can see, oh, okay. Now, that's just like a very simple example, but sometimes it's better. You need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture and look at like what is the ultimate goal, because our relationship with Christ on earth is to set us up for our relationship with Christ after death.
Yeah, exactly.
To elaborate on that, people said if you in heaven you're gonna lose yourself. Like, for example, in heaven it said no crying, no tear, and I heard AT like that sounds kind of like one of those movies where you just act like everything's okay. You know what I mean? Like, do you get what I'm trying to say?
But again, I think, but again, it's
like you're not being yourself how you were.
I think the problem there is, again, it's just like we have no concept of how good it will be. Like, all of these words that we see in the Bible are essentially a way to try and convey something that is really can't put into words, in terms of what it's going to be like to be with God ultimately, and what it will look like when we have that face-to-face relationship. Like, these words are an approximation, if that makes sense. Like, this is such a wonderful truth, but it can't be described in words. You can get something that gives you an idea of it, but it's not a perfect description. And I'm trying to think. It's like, okay, say you had never tasted chocolate before, right?
Yeah.
And like the only thing you'd ever had was people telling you descriptions of chocolate, right?
Yeah.
And like maybe from that you're like, chocolate might, you're like, if all you ever hear is descriptions of chocolate, you're like, chocolate might not be that big a deal. But then when you actually finally get to taste it, that's when you understand. Now, okay, I'm basing this on the assumption that you like chocolate, so maybe you don't. But assuming you do, then that is when you get that experience. You can only know how good chocolate is when you actually taste it. I can tell you all the words under the sun about how wonderful chocolate is, but if you never actually tasted it, you don't get it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Again, this is a trite example, but it's just to try and give a picture as an analogy.
I get it.
And I think another aspect of it is that we're so... The fallen, sinful world and our fallen, sinful selves is all we know. We can't imagine what it's like to be without it. I mean, it's like asking a fish how's the water. Like, they don't know. Fish only know to be wet. They have no idea what it is to be anything other than wet. And we don't know what it is anything other than to be in a world where the world around us is broken and we're also broken. And so, I mean, to not be able to be in a world where our own inner brokenness is gone and there is no more brokenness around us, where we see God as he truly is, and we are who God truly intended us to be. And as Rama said, you can't, ultimately you're only going to know it when you experience it. But I think part of what gets in the way is that we're trying, again, all this stuff is so much of a part of our background that we can't even imagine like life without pain. We can't imagine life without sadness. We can't imagine life without disappointment.
I know something. I know. Sorry to interrupt, but I know something, right? In the beginning, right? Of the Word, and the Word was God.
Mm-hmm.
If God was really like powerful, atheists be saying they're really powerful then, and he knows the future. Why was he surprised when Adam ate the apple?
I don't think he was surprised.
Yeah, no point does it say he was surprised.
You mean like why did God ask like where are you, Adam, all that? Is that what you mean?
I mean, you could put that into. I was just like he was like, I don't know. He felt like he was surprised a little bit.
No, I mean he was sussing him out with the "Where are you, Adam?" That was because he was hiding, and it was basically putting it on him to freak himself out.
Another scenario is when you have a child and the child has disobeyed you, and you know they've been naughty, but you give them the chance to own up, and you go to them. It's like let's say they went somewhere they were not supposed to, and you go, "Where were you?" All right, you know exactly where they were. They weren't supposed to be in room A, and you say, "Where were you?" In the last hour, and you're giving them the chance to say, "Oh, I was in room A, and I wasn't supposed to be there," as an example. So you can ask the question even though you know the answer, but it's about the interaction and giving them the chance to confess and to repent.
How about this to make it harder? What if atheists reply back to you by saying, doesn't God know who will go to hell and who will go to heaven?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, God does know that.
Yeah.
Oh. Wait. I guess. Wait a minute. Then what's the point of?
Right. Okay. No. I think I can see what your difficulty is. Right.
Okay.
Knowing what somebody's going to choose doesn't mean that you've made their choice for them.
Like if you could see
those two things are not the same.
Like God is like infinite, so he could see like the future and the past, and he exists at the future, past, present, everything, everywhere. So like he knows the beginning and the end.
He can see every choice, but that doesn't
So
mean...
determined by you, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, so he knows every choice that you make, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean he made that choice for you. You still make that choice.
I get what you're saying.
Would an analogy of a movie, would that work?
Yes,
Would that work?
I was just thinking about that. Like the bad guy, you think this guy's gonna be the bad guy throughout the rest of the movie, but really like he had a character development, and then now he's actually the good guy or something like. You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, like if you like watch.
Unless you spoiled yourself and then you notice that this guy's actually not the bad guy, and then he actually was a good guy.
Like God's.
I get what you're trying to say.
God watched all the spoilers of eternity.
Yeah,
I mean,
God has all the spoilers.
I mean, another way of thinking about it of the difference of perspectives. If you stand by the railroad tracks and you're seeing cars go by, and you don't know what cars are coming, you might be able to look down a little bit and see, but there's a certain point where you just don't know what's coming. You got to wait for the car to get close enough you can see it.
Yeah.
But if you're up in a helicopter, you can see the whole thing at once. Like everything from end to end. In a certain sense, that's to some extent analogous to our perspective in time, where events are like train cars going one back another, versus God's perspective up in the helicopter, where he sees the whole thing at once. Great questions. Good discussion.
All right. I think we shall wrap up.
Yes.
So we will have another session next month.
Yep.
Which I will be talking about why God sends people to hell. So after all that conversation, so hopefully,
They send themselves.
or do they send them? Yeah, or do they send themselves to hell? So yeah, there's a sneak preview there.
I'm sorry, I don't remember your name.
Oh, my name is
But
Ezekiel.
thank you very much for coming, folks.
Bob.